All right, if you have the color-coded piece, again, we're going to keep looking at this closely. And I apologize for the small print there. If you want, I can email this to you, and if you want to blow it up, don't hesitate to contact me. I can send that to you. The footnotes in this are really quite good. They're quite good. It was interesting. I don't know how many of you are familiar with John MacArthur. That tradition, kind of covenant reformed. It's a kind of a conservative reformed tradition. I don't know if you know this, but about 80% of Bible translators today are come out of the Reformed tradition. So you have like there's the Catholic tradition, right? Roman Catholic tradition, and so that's the church informing Scripture. We struggle with that model a little bit. And then you have a Lutheran tradition, which is adamant about inerrancy and inspiration and law and gospel, properly dividing law and gospel. And then you have a Reformed tradition. And the Reformed tradition is will use terms like the sovereignty of God. They love that term. God is in control, the sovereignty of God. Predestination kind of comes out of that model. And so, wonderful Bible scholars. All of these have really some wonderful Bible scholars. And then you have like an Anabaptist tradition, which is more non-denominational Baptist churches. And then there's a holiness tradition. Very few translations out of that one. But the Reformed, Lutheran, Catholic, those are the three groups that really do that. Like the NIV, the reason our denomination doesn't love the NIV is because it was so heavily influenced by the Reformed tradition. So there's choices in translations, right? You always are making choices. How do I translate that word? Do I translate it as obey? Or do I translate it as keep?
So what translation
guard?
would you say to buy? Because I want to get a big print for future.
I advertise and try to get these all the time, the Concordia Self-Study Bible,
Okay.
which is now out of print.
But they don't have any big print. do they?
Well, I could probably find you one.
Okay, okay.
I mean, and this is NIV. Now, did you know there's about 3 or 4 different translations of the NIV? So there's the 1984. So the first one came out about 78, and it was a little rough. It was their first draft. And then this one came out, this is my favorite, the 1984 NIV. I really like it. For me as a pastor, for teaching and caring for people. For an academic version of the Bible, one that is as literal to the Greek text as you can get, the NASB, is about as literal. It's hard to read, though, because it's goofy. I mean, when you read it, it's very stiff. We call it very wooden. So, but it's really accurate. Boy, it's like word for word. And most of the times when you're going from one language to another, you have to kind of go phrase by phrase. And then it gets a little looser when it's thought by thought. That gets pretty loose. Because then you're really guessing. So we have really good ideas of how to translate the words. We have things to compare it to. So anyway, I love this because I love the notes in this Bible. Like the Lutheran Study Bible, I think is excellent. The ESV is an excellent translation. English Standard Version is excellent. But it's a little more wooden. I don't like it as much for public reading. I think it's great for if you're a Bible scholar, student. The ESV is very trustworthy, but I don't love its notes. They're good, but there are a lot of prayers and quotes of Luther. And I really don't need quotes of Luther that much, here and there. But I really like this one because it took the NIV Study Bible, when that came out, that was it's 1984, and then it added some Lutheran notes to the study notes. So what I like about it is, it says some traditions believe this about communion. Lutheran tradition, Lutheran doctrine says this. And it doesn't say, and we're right, and those guys are all wrong. I mean, I really like that. It just says this is how we read that text.
This is the Concordia Self-Study Bible?
Yeah, that's my favorite. I sold you one.
You did?
I propagandized you.
You might have, because I was really glad
I got a bunch of them. I collect them all the time. So I sell them for $20. You get them online, they're used. But the notes are just great, and it's a really good, trustworthy, like the NIV got weirder, so there's a 2000 translation, and there's another one, and it got real politically correct, and, you know, gender neutral, and it just got weird. So, that's all. That is all. So let's look at page 3. Page 3, this is where we're at, okay? So we have that unique little piece at the bottom of 2, at the residence of Annas, and that's John. And John adds this later. He was the one, by the way, you know this, I think, he's the one who takes Peter to the courtyard of the high priest, because he knew someone in the, who worked there.
That was John.
That was John. So that's why you get this blue area at the bottom of 2, that's unique to John. His own personal memories. So he adds it to enrich the account of the Passion. Now let's go to the top of 3. And here again we get all of them pitching in, you know. So then he's taken as a prisoner to Caiaphas, who is the current high priest. So he's Annas' son-in-law, and Annas had been the high priest. And by the way, in Jerusalem, I told you, we think it's likely, at least it's a 50-50 chance that we found those remains of Caiaphas. Because the burial ossuaries of high priests, I mean, they were noted and tracked, and there's records and stuff like that. So we think that we are very confident, very certain that we found his home, where Jesus was taken. That's a very moving experience. I did not love all the things in Jerusalem and our trip to Israel. But I'll give you this counsel: if you take an Israel trip, see if you can load up heavily in Galilee. It's so cool. Because the Galilee, you can picture yourself sitting on the hillside listening to the Sermon on the Mount. You can be on the Sea of Galilee imagining Jesus say, throw down on the other side, you know, or a storm coming up on it. Or, you know, you can just imagine. It's not, but in Jerusalem, you know, since the Middle Ages and before, it's been so reworked and reworked and reworked, you know, and people venerate like things, which is awkward for me, you know. Here's a spot in the floor where Jesus was actually born, you know. You're going.
Those surveillance cameras weren't in style yet.
All the videotapes have been lost. So, you know, things like that. Whereas, like you go to Masada, that's amazing. Dead Sea, Qumran, amazing, amazing. Jericho, it's kind of amazing, in large part because the Palestinians are kind of in charge of Jericho, and they haven't taken care of it. I mean, it's not built over; it's just like done. It's a ruin. It was interesting. But this is, in Jerusalem, of course, the Western Wall. Right? We used to call it the Wailing Wall. Jewish people hate it if you call it that now. Don't call it that. The Western Wall of the temple remains, and there are some steps which. Really, we are very confident Jesus stood and spoke and taught from, that it remained. That's pretty powerful when you're sitting there. And then the Pool of Bethesda, that's pretty cool. That's still there, you know, in that Jerusalem area, Jerusalem. And then Caiaphas' home, because he's taken bound there, this scene. We know this place. It's down there where Jesus is humiliated, mocked, beaten, and awaits trial. See, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, could not legally conduct a trial at night. They broke a number of rules of the Jewish law. They didn't have you had to have, for a murder trial, for a death sentence, a capital offense, you had to have the whole Sanhedrin there. You had to have 3 witnesses that agreed in their testimony. It had to be done during the day so that it was a public knowledge. It was acknowledged publicly that they were meeting on that. Even though just those 3 rules were tossed aside in this trial of Jesus. And that, by the way, is prophesied in Isaiah. Isaiah 53, by oppression and judgment he was taken away. He did not get a fair trial, would he? You know, so it's an interesting thing. So, here we have, Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, so that's a unique element that John knew, the high priest's house, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. This is Matthew, the yellow. Now the chief priests, the elders, and the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none, even though many false witnesses came forward. Their testimonies did not agree. That's Mark. Right, that's Mark. And then, but at last, 2 false witnesses came forward, and then Mark bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard this fellow say, I will destroy the temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands." But not even then did their testimony agree. But let's stop there for just a second, because this kind of raises the question. This is another challenging thing exegetically from the text. But again, my purpose for doing this with you really is seeing how when you put them all together, boy, it gives you the full testimony. It really gives you a full, accurate testimony. You see this lengthy footnotes that you have on this page are very small? This is one of the things that's, I always wondered this myself. When Jesus says, the only sign I give this wicked and adulterous generation is the sign of Jonah. There's water. Is the sign of Jonah, who just as he was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days and 3 nights. And this is tricky, right? So we read that and we say, but Jesus wasn't in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights. Right? So we struggle with that. Now, I'm going to just say this first of all. Jewish language is Semitic. And Semitic languages, Semitic languages include things like Farsi and Arabic and Chinese and Japanese and Hindi, that whole area of Asia, that whole area, Asia Minor to Asia Major. And Japanese is this way. We discovered this in Japan. Japanese is so interesting, and many of these languages are this way, where the verb comes last. So, and it's because many of these are cultures of, gosh, I'll get the term wrong, the cultures of offense. You're constantly trying to avoid offending. There's a term for that, gosh, arrogant. Pride cultures or something like that. You have to guard your pride. You have to guard your, Japanese is very much this way. And it's very racist. I mean, it's very discriminatory. Right? If you talk a certain way to a person in this way, you're fired. I mean, if you talk to the boss of the company in the way you would talk to your buddies at the bar, you're fired. You know, I did a major fail when I talked to the principal of the school we were at. He was in the hierarchy, he was here, and I'm just this gaijin foreign. And I said something that a kid had told me to say, because they were teaching me Japanese. So they would come over to the house, we would teach them English, and I said, teach us Japanese. Well, they were teaching us high school Japanese, like Matthew Land. You know, Matthew Land has his own language. Yeah, W Besser. So anyway, so I said this thing to him. So anyway, in Japanese, they have the verb last so you can change it. You can watch the reaction of the people, and you can change the direction or impact of the sentence. And you have a chance to observe that. Now with Latin speakers, English, Western speakers, our languages are linear, not circular. They're linear. And so you commit early, right? You have a subject and a verb, and you're committed. And then what you can change is your direct and indirect objects and descriptors and things like that. But you're kind of committed. So it's really interesting. So this is an example. I just want you to know, if people say this to you, so as Western thinkers, we look at that and say 3 days and 3 nights doesn't add up. It's not right. You can't think that way. You got to think like a Jewish thinker. So here in your page, this is really good. If you look down on page 3, and so what this is, what Jesus is doing, because there are numerous places, look at all these references. He uses the term, there are 3 terms, really, in 3 days, after 3 days, the 3rd day. So it's tricky. The Jonah reference is a hapax legumena. It's a single time occurrence. It's the only time it appears in the New Testament. And so it's always tricky to use those singular expressions. These are the expressions used numerous times in reference to the resurrection, Jesus' death and resurrection. So in 3 days, after 3 days, the third day. So what it's called is, in Hebrew, in those Semitic languages, is inclusive reasoning, is what it's called, inclusive reasoning. And you can read this yourself, but I just want you to be confident. Nobody was trying to trick anybody. Nobody was trying to, they didn't, you can't play gotcha with this. Now it is interesting because in Western thinking, we do this with words all the time. We catch you, right, in a mistake. And there it's in print and it's in words and it doesn't add up. And now we got you. And that's why the Western legal system is all based on words. It's all based on legal contracts. It's not the case in Semitic thinking. Of course they have legal systems, and of course they write things down. And they have adopted lots of Western things, but in this culture it is far different than that. So those terms are common. And anyway, so our problem is, he says here in this, our problem is not what phrases may mean to Westerners, but what Jesus meant by them and his Near Eastern hearers understood by them. So what's the meaning of a day? A day really did mean, here's the thing. In Jewish thinking, any portion of a day they would refer to as a day, as a whole day. They didn't think about it that way. Here's another one. I'll give you another example. They pierced his hands and his feet. It says in Psalm 22. Psalm 22, right? They pierced his hands and his feet. Well, we are virtually, absolutely certain that crucifixion victims had nails through the wrists, right? They would do the wrists and then through the feet. But they would never do it through the hands because it would tear right out. Or they'd have to do all kinds of other things. But if they nailed it through the wrist, they'd stay pegged up there. And it was horrifyingly painful. Horrifyingly. Because there's this, what is the nerve in there? Medial or something like that is what it's called? It's a big old nerve that's right in there. So bang! Anyway, it pins them on there through that. It's horrible, isn't it? So, but here's the thing. So people would go, oh, see, Bible is wrong. He wasn't nailed through the hands, he was nailed through the wrist. Well, in Roman understanding, you can see thousands of sculptures like this, like that. Because they worked on the hand. But they considered this the hand, from this part up. So when you'll see all these, like from art schools in Rome, ancient things, and it's always that. That's what they consider the hand. So you just have to understand what that culture was saying when they were saying it. So anyway, what it really means, so here, let's go down. Different periods of time, it's right halfway down, different phrases for same period. So it's clear from the flag, Jesus refers to at different times in the same period, the interval between his death and his resurrection as in 3 days. So Jesus refers to this consistently. That's what the phrase means when we talk about like after 3 days, on the third day. Once, because he's quoting from Jonah, see I mentioned that, he uses the phrase 3 days and 3 nights. Well, unless we accuse Jesus of contradicting himself, we accept that all these phrases as meaning the same period of time. Even the priests and Pharisees who quoted Jesus as predicting his resurrection after 3 days asked Pilate to have the tomb guarded until the third day, not until after the third day. In other words, this is just an example of people love to play gotcha with the Bible, gotcha with Christians. See, it doesn't say that. It's not true. You should know that Jesus consistently uses a variety of expressions commonly accepted as. We would say it as this, on the third day. That's how we would say it. But Jesus could say that same intention about 4 different ways. Is that fair? Is that any question on that? I just want you to know that. This is an apologetics thing, kind of. It's just what we know through our study of the text. Okay? So, because he dies, we think about 3 p.m., pretty close. We have this pretty carefully in the gospel accounts. 3 p.m. on Friday. Then it's Sabbath, sundown. He's taken to the tomb before sundown, not carefully prepared, just loosely wrapped, laid in the tomb, a rich man's tomb, stone rolled in front, guard assigned, right? The Pharisees said, please assign a guard until the third day. He has a guard assigned, there's a seal on the tomb from Pilate, the Roman governor, right? That's the condition Friday at 4 p.m., 5 p.m. at sundown. At sundown on Friday. Then we get all of Saturday, and then after dawn on Sunday, they come, it's after dawn, the stone is rolled away, the tomb is empty, a messenger, one or more messengers are there to greet whoever comes to the tomb. Clearly, the moving of the stone and Jesus' miraculous resurrection has, they found the guards like dead men, and then they ran away, because there's none, right? So first of all, they fainted. When they came to, they ran away, because they're probably terrified for their lives, right? Because as Roman guards, you have one job. You have one job, this easy one. They didn't know how impossible it would be for them to fulfill their task, right? But that your life would be forfeit. Just like we know this, like from the jailer in Philippi. Remember, Paul and Silas are there, and there's an earthquake, and the jailer's about to take his own life, and Paul says, don't do it, we're all here. Because that's why he would have. He had failed in his task as a Roman soldier. So that's the idea. So that's what we know from that. And then Sunday morning. So you have those within 3 days. On the third day. That's really how we would say it. Okay? Good? All right. Anyway, he has a wonderful, he goes into the Old Testament and shows a number of expressions that follow this same pattern. So he does a great job in his research on here. I'm impressed. Okay, so they could not find testimony. Now Matthew is the one who really highlights this because, again, Matthew is about Jewish law and making his case to the Jews. And it was in Deuteronomy that it says you have to find 3 witnesses that agree for a capital offense, 2 for any other offense. And with women, it took like 3 for any offense. You had to have 3. It just didn't count as much in that culture. So it's Matthew who makes that. So they bore false witness, and clearly they were making a case against him being an insurrectionist, right? A revolutionary. Let's go ahead and turn the page. So, but not even then did their testimony agree, and the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him, saying to him, and this is an interesting parallel we have to Isaiah, again chapter 53, as a sheep before a shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. Now eventually Jesus does answer, right? Eventually he does. But what would have been typical is, here's an accusation, here's my defense. Here's an accusation, here's my defense. Jesus makes no defense. And they are surprised by this. What are you doing? Why don't you answer, right? I put you under oath. Now he's putting Jesus under oath. And you get this again from Matthew. By the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of the Blessed. That's an interesting, that is an interesting, because that was not universally accepted by all Jews. That the Messiah was in fact the living Son of God. It's very interesting. So you will note, when you pay attention to the gospel accounts closely, the disciples' theology that they express lines up. Who does it line up with? Do you know this? Can you guess? Based on the different religious groups of the day? Or the Jewish religious groups? Yeah, they line right up with the Pharisees. Really interesting. The Pharisees far and away, and the Pharisees for the most part were kind of the lay leaders. We would call them elders today. And they did rabbinic work too in the synagogue. See, that was different. The synagogue was different. The temple was the show. That was Major League Baseball. The synagogues were the farm clubs, right? This was like high school football. But they, in their local communities, they carried tremendous influence because they were seen as being very, very devout. And they were. I mean, they were. Ryan Strelo and I go around about this every once in a while and saying, we have to be careful hammering on the Pharisees too badly. I said, as long as I don't hammer on them worse than Jesus, I'm okay. Because he really. But again, we know there were Pharisees that did follow Jesus. And a number, and probably they're not the only ones. Those are the ones. I mean, when Nicodemus says we, I don't think it just means himself and Joseph of Arimathea. We think there's a cadre who are scared, but moved. And I think The Chosen actually does a nice job of portraying this, because it's hard to move people who for centuries have now convinced themselves that their righteousness is what will bring the advent of the Messiah. Their holiness, their faithfulness, their righteousness. By the way, there's a version of this in Christianity today. We call it post-millennialism. Remember when I talked about Revelation and eschatology, end times? So dispensational premillennialism, that's like Calvary Chapel, right? It's following that kind of literally, not really, but as well as they can, kind of following the timeline. And you got Antichrist in 7 years of, and then you got Satan's little season, and you got the Great Tribulation. The two witnesses show up, and the temple is rebuilt, and all that. You have all that very literal understanding of that. And that means that all this tribulation will happen, then you have the rapture, all this tribulation, and then comes Christ. So it's before the millennium of Christ, the millennial rule of Christ. So that's premillennialism. And that's kind of the dominant one you hear in TV and movies and so forth. It's very popular. Left Behind series, all that. But then you have post-millennialism, and that's like Pat Robertson is in that group. That's Pat Robertson's. And the idea is we bring the coming of the Messiah if we can get our society on the right track. So it's electing enough Christian leaders, mayors, and presidents, and passing laws, and getting our society back on track to a godly path, and then comes Messiah. So you actually usher in a millennium here of the church, who is actually guiding the moral compass of the world, and then Messiah comes. Ours is amillennial. We think Easter was we think God wins on Easter, and now we're in the tribulation now until His return. This is a hard time, but we think Easter was the great. So ours is like amillennial. We're in it. This is kind of what we do, because we don't take millennium as a literal 1,000. It's 10 times 10 times 10. So anyway, but that's the idea here. They line up with the Pharisees like tight as can be. Like they come across the blind guy, who sinned, this guy or his father? Pharisees. That's how Pharisees thought. They won't come in the house of Matthew the tax collector. Pharisee, right? I can't touch that dead body. He's ritually unclean. That was a Pharisee thing. So those were Talmudic laws that had been developed over and above the Torah itself, and the common people of the day typically aligned with them. Now, if you lived in Jerusalem, you lined up more with the Sadducees, because the Sadducees were the professional clergy and ran the temple. And you see, you could never get your sins forgiven or atoned for in a synagogue. See, I love our Lutheran theology where we say just in the preaching of the word, God gives his grace and His gospel to you. You can absolutely be assured. I love this quote from Luther. He said, out of all the things we do, he says he loves communion. He rejoices in our baptism, but it's the preaching of the word which takes precedence over all other things.
You don't have to go to St. Louis?
Yeah. Well, I do. No, I mean, that was the thing. So the Sadducees, though, held sway over a lot of the ultimate feelings of the Jews. Yeah, these Pharisees are good, and the rabbis in my hometown are okay, but the real deal is at the temple in Jerusalem, because that was, like, right now, or I think they just finished, was Yom Kippur in Israel, just finished. And so it's about a 7-day celebration and so forth, and it's preceded by the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover and so forth. So, oh no, sorry, that comes in the spring. So Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, scapegoat, that's now. So, they lined up with them in their local community, but when you went to Jerusalem, the Sadducees were the big deal, because they ran the temple and ran the sacrifices and oversaw that whole thing.
Pastor?
Yes?
Is that why they took Jesus to Jerusalem to be blessed at the temple?
Oh, absolutely. 100%.
Everybody had to go to Jerusalem to have their firstborn.
If you could. Yeah, it was the expectation.
Because you couldn't do it at a synagogue.
Right. Our guess is that Mary and Joseph were what we would call lower middle class. They were probably in that spot. They probably lived kind of paycheck to paycheck, but it appears that they made the pilgrimages to Jerusalem, you know, pretty faithfully. But that was a requirement of every able-bodied Jewish man. And they didn't all go. So they're pretty devout, and they have the means to do it, but it looks like they were scrimping and saving to make it happen. You know? Yeah. So that's our best guess. All those are all guesses, but yes, that's why they're there.
Bethlehem wasn't very far away from Jerusalem.
No, not in that particular case. That was a blessing. That they could go for the naming easily for that one. But you know, when they go in when he's 12, that's a thing.
So when they took it, was it the 8th day or something?
Yeah, but they're in the region. Bethlehem
Right, they're
is
in Bethlehem, yeah.
Yeah, Bethlehem is relatively
And the
close.
wise men haven't shown up with all the money, so.
Yeah, you know, we have such debate about that. Most people think it came probably about a year after.
Right.
I mean, that makes the most kind of sense. I can live with that they show up a day or a few days later. I can live there. Because, what do you think? If they stayed in the stable for the next week and a half? No, I mean, they're gonna, as soon as a room comes open, they're going in.
Yeah.
It's a mom with a baby. I mean, I'm guessing, even then, somebody would have a tender heart and say,
But didn't Herod like calculate
oh yeah.
slaughter
He-
like 2 years or
He
something?
covers his hiney is what he does. So we say the child could have been as old as 2. Now that's almost certainly not correct because Herod would have covered himself.
Yeah.
So I would say he's a year or less. So I think good scholarship says they came, because let's imagine that the star appears, which is probably certainly kind of a confluence of lights in the sky, and that's what causes it to move too, kind of give them direction, because there's movement on it, and I think God made that all happen. Absolutely, God had that in. That was God doing that, it's not just coincidence. But then it could have been at the birth, right, that happened, that confluence of brightness, but it could have happened a year before. And they saw it and they followed, because the star led them to the place of the child's birth, right? So, because that trip took them
A while.
at least months.
Yeah.
At least months. And you know, when they show up in Jerusalem, it's not 3 dudes in a taxi. I mean, all of Jerusalem was troubled. So Herod was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. Well, when the king's troubled, the whole town's troubled.
I'm sure it's a caravan.
And he was
you know,
always
they
troubled.
aren't gonna just have 3 camels, there's gonna be a whole
There's
group.
going to be a whole entourage. It could be a whole thing, and it's probably, you see them coming from a distance. They probably send people ahead looking for lodgings, places to put where do they pack their tents? Because they're certainly nomadic people too. Where do they pitch their tents? Where do they water their animals? So it's a hoop-de-doo. So it's a big deal. But it also could have been that they landed there in Jerusalem, met with Herod, kept their crew there, and then went to Bethlehem, because it's, I think, 7 or 8 miles, I think, is what Bethlehem is. So they might have gone with a much smaller.
But they had to reconnect with them because they didn't go back to Jerusalem.
Well, that's true, they went home by another way. So which way they went, no, you're probably right. You're probably right. So anyway, there's lots of speculation on that. In my mind, I always want to kind of imagine they showed up like the next day. Because it says when they came to the house, because we know they're not in the stable. Anyway,
Sorry, one last question.
Yeah, please.
I know we're digressing, but,
no, I love it.
with the star above, how would they know it's exactly Bethlehem? I guess I've always pondered that.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm gonna speak a little bit out of ignorance. A lot of this I equate with guys who, captains, seafarers who travel by the stars. It's one of the great creation arguments, the Genesis creation account argument that I love, is the stars and the sun and the moon were put there for humanity's use, not as gods for us to worship, because one of the great gifts of the stars in the heavens is navigation, right? And that would be the same whether you're on the ocean or you're crossing a desert, right? How do you keep so there's the North Star, you keep walking towards the North Star. We did this in Boy Scouts. If you got lost, you could always do that because if you could see the star. How you could find it, the Little Dipper, in
Well,
northern
they
hemisphere.
knew because the Old Testament said it, that the Savior was gonna be born in Bethlehem.
Correct. They had read that, yep.
And if you went too far, then you'd have to go back because the star wouldn't be overhead.
Yeah.
If you would have gone
yes,
fast,
okay.
you'd have to go
I
back.
would call it a less than exact method. Right? I mean, you're kind of getting in the neighborhood, is the idea, but you're walking that way. I mean, and that comes out of Numbers, is that prophecy. A star will rise in Jacob, a scepter, a kingdom. And so we have that all the way back in the book of Numbers. So they had seen that, and then they'd seen the other ones that said Bethlehem.
Yeah.
And Herod's scholars, you know, Sadducees, they affirm that. Because again, they did believe in the first 5 books. So you have, so they're getting to the general, and of course you're gonna go to the capital. You're gonna think there's a king
That makes
there.
sense. Yep.
So, but I would say it's not like it's GPS quite.
It is talking to shepherds.
Yeah, yeah, that's true, that's true. Well, and you know, to be honest, why not? Because what does it say? The shepherds told everybody everything they had done. They had seen, they went back praising, glorifying God, telling everyone. So, and they were there the night of the birth. Must have been a crazy story making the rounds. Those crazy shepherds. Those crazy shepherds and their moonshine. They're out there drinking moonshine. Pretty cool. But the people that were paying attention. Anyway, it's kind of cool. Oh, look on page 4 too. So here's the thing. Let's just look at the footnotes. This is a good little summary too here. Since the common custom of inclusive reckoning is well attested for the Hebrews and for other nations, and in the East down to modern times, it seems wholly unreasonable to understand Jesus' words about a 3-day period in terms of our modern Western mathematical method of reckoning. By common usage, his hearers would count the 3 days successively as the day of the crucifixion, the day after the event, the 3rd day after, by modern count, the 2nd day after. So anyway, that's just, he does a nice job of concluding that. So if Jesus said he would rise after 3 days, after the end of the 3rd full day, or 72 hours, then he would have said on the 4th day. So anyway, it's just good to know how they think it. Now, the next one he has down there, crucifixion on Friday. So let's look at this. Because there is some, there are a number of different speculations. There's one even that says that Jesus was crucified on Wednesday, which is, I had never heard that theory before. He does some good research on it. Now, it's interesting, on the road to Emmaus, Luke 24, 2 disciples met him on the road to Emmaus. And in talking of the crucifixion, because Jesus joins them and they don't recognize him. Remember this is on Easter Sunday, in the evening. And in their own deep disappointment, they said, today is the 3rd day since these things were done. So that, again, is a different source saying it in the same way. Jesus himself said when he appeared to the 12 in the upper room, thus it was proper for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the 3rd day, on the 3rd day. Paul says later in Corinthians, he rose again the 3rd day according to the scriptures. Sunday was the 3rd day. Okay, so then he goes into a discussion of what is the day of the crucifixion. So let's just read up in the text. So then he makes this testimony. Again, Matthew is the one who recorded Jesus saying, Jesus said to Caiaphas, it is as you said, I am. Now it's interesting that it's Mark or Peter. That's what he records. Because John is the one who makes a great point of that statement, the I am, the God word, name in Greek, ego eimi. Then Matthew goes on, nevertheless I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. What's he quoting? Daniel, right? He's quoting Daniel. Again, just a quick review, the Son of Man. In Ezekiel, I'll do this very quickly. Jesus' use of the Son of Man is brilliant. It's rich. It's amazing. In Ezekiel, the Son of Man referred to someone who was merely human, was just a human, didn't have the mind of God or the wisdom of God. That's how God talks to Ezekiel. Look, you're just a dude. Okay, stop kind of questioning me. But in Daniel, the Son of Man is a divine being. All nations will worship him. It's really quite a contrast. So when Jesus goes around naming himself as the Son of Man, it's brilliant. Because they're all going, which one does he mean? And the answer is yes. You know, fully human, fully divine. So, and when he quotes this in Daniel, now the veil is off. There is no question what he means. I am the one all nations will bow to. All nations will worship. And then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, and by the way, just funny little biblical trivia note, that is an oddity. The high priest would not do this because he's wearing very specific garments that you did not tear. So if that is the case, where if he's wearing those garments and tearing them, either that means he made a major faux pas, or he was overcome by his passion, or he wasn't wearing them. But in any event, that's the sign of blasphemy, is you tore your garments. This is why when Jesus is worshipped and so forth, we take that as a major sign, that he is God. He receives worship. If he was a good, faithful Jewish rabbi, and John, Thomas says to him, oh, my Lord and my God, bows down and worships him, Jesus should, how dare you? There's only one God. But Jesus receives that. So, what further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him and said he is deserving of death. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him. Some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and beat him, say to him, prophesy to us. Now there again is Matthew, right? Prophesy. Prophesy to us. Who is the one who struck you? And what Matthew is contrasting is, look at all the prophetic utterances in the Old Testament that Jesus is fulfilling, and they are mocking him, not even paying attention. This is the interesting thing always about Jesus. And as part of this theme in the sermons I'm doing with Matthew, is I keep repeating to you, stop keeping score, right? This is not about keeping score. This is about God's grace. Look who made it into heaven, Matthew. Look at who Jesus home, who's visiting, and so forth. So you have all of these beautiful examples. But in this one, and they would say, the disciples, they would get so mad. Here's this guy who's been paralyzed for life, and they're all mad at Jesus for healing him on the Sabbath. And you want to go, wait a minute. He healed him. What does that say to you? Or like in The Chosen, they do a great scene with the feeding of the 4,000 in the Decapolis with all the Gentiles and everything. He feeds them all, and as the rabbis come up from Jerusalem, they go, they ate together? And the guy looking at him says, did you just hear what I said? He just fed thousands and thousands of people. The fish was just multiplied. And what a blessing that someday Jews and Gentiles together will sit down at the heavenly banquet and eat together. That is going to be such a wonder that even we are invited to the heavenly banquet with Moses and Abraham and Ruth and Esther. Won't that be something? Even we're the late,
Been adopted.
We've been adopted, grafted. We're just grafted. Okay, we need to let you go. All right.
Was blasphemy always a death penalty? Always?
Yeah, if it was convicted in that. If you actually did it, you didn't recant, you didn't repent, you claimed it and held to it. Absolutely. Absolutely. Especially in front of Jewish leaders. But most people recanted or said no or whatever. Okay, if we have to go, go ahead.